begin in the northern Iraqi city of Kirkuk, where for a second day security forces have been battling dozens of militants from the Islamic State group who infiltrated that city and launched their attack at precisely the moment attentions were focused 170 kilometers away on the city of Mosul. Well, officials in Kirkuk said that at least 80 people, most of them Iraqi soldiers, have been killed during these past 2 days of violence. 48 jihadist attackers are also reported to have been killed and several others injured. The Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, meanwhile, says that reinforcements are being sent to Kirkuk. France 24's Adam Pletz was in the area earlier on today. He brings us the latest.
Earlier today, a city that's still reeling from Friday's, that is, attack by Islamic State group in what seems like an attempt to distract from the offensive on Mosul, but also to hit Kurdish forces in what they hoped would be a softer target. And this is a complex attack which hit several locations. 48 members of the Islamic State group were killed and some 10 members of the Kurdish security forces. Now, we met with the second highest ranking member of the Peshmerga in the Kirkuk area, who showed us around one of the locations that had been hit. That's a Kurdish security forces base, and it was still very fresh from the fight, to quite disturbing sights. They had actually placed the body of one of the Islamic State group fighters who blew himself up with a suicide vest. They had placed that in a bin, and you could still hear fighting in the distance some 5 kilometers away from us, which we were told were isolated members of Islamic State group cells that they had pinned down and were now pursuing. So there were still after effects from yesterday's attack, and certainly you could hear that fighting continuing in the distance. But the Peshmerga felt that they dealt with the Islamic State group's offensive on that city, smuggling fighters into Kirkuk, but they didn't rule out, of course, the possibility that this could happen again in Kirkuk or other locations which Islamic State group may try to target in Kurdistan to distract from Mosul, where they're obviously losing ground against both the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces.
That was France 24's Adam Pletz reporting from Erbil in northern Iraq.
Mike Harris, editor of Veterans Today. Thanks so much for being with us. Mike, what do you make of the Kremlin's comments that actually Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, as a matter of fact, must remain in power in order to stop the terrorism?
Well, I agree. I think the Kremlin is spot on. You look where the U.S. has intervened, whether it's Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan, and they leave behind every place the U.S. intervenes is a failed state. And that is a right ground, it's fertile ground for terrorist organizations to grow. I think that the Assad regime, if you look at all of the countries out there, the Arabic countries, Syria was the model. It was a secular regime. It was religiously tolerant. Christians were welcome. Jews were welcome. Various aspects of Islam were welcome. There was no strife. There's no sectarian violence. It was a solid, sound, secular regime, and it needs to be protected. This nonsense with the U.S. and others going in there and intervening, supporting terrorism, is merely a surrogate war to topple Assad. That's all it is. If the U.S. was true to what our pronounced constitutional values are, we would be supporting Assad, not trying to take him out.
Well, it's interesting what you've said. We've heard actually in some of the presidential debates, actually we know Donald Trump is the one who has said, as a matter of fact, that the United States should not have been on the side that they're on, that they should have been supporting Assad because he said the Syrians, the Russians, and the Iranians, he said, were actually the ones fighting terrorism, fighting Daesh. Are we going to see a change, though, in Washington's position?
Well, it depends on who wins the election. I think that if Mr. Trump wins the election, I think we might see a change in the election. He's going to have a lot of institutional inertia to fight. I think he's going to have to dismiss half the Pentagon as well as half the State Department in order to get a new foreign policy in there. But I think that Mr. Trump is offering us our first ray of sunlight in a very, very long time about a U.S. foreign policy that actually makes sense, that benefits the people of the U.S. as well as does not threaten other governments around the world.
Thanks so much for being with us out of Portland, Mr. Mike Harris, editor of Veterans.
Well, for more now on the situation in Mosul, I'm joined on the set by France 24's expert on terrorist movements, Wassim Nasr. Wassim, what's the latest you've been hearing about what's been happening on the ground around Mosul?
Actually, since 3 days, there's a push from the east and then from the southeast too. And we know, for example, if you can see the map, that the French artillery is based just under the town of Al Houd, where we see in here. So we see French artillery, U.S. artillery, and U.S. special forces trying to bomb all the defensive positions around the town of Mosul, so all the villages. Yesterday they had very harsh fighting in Al Houd, and today we got to know that 2 new fronts got opened by the Peshmerga and also by the Iraqi forces. If you can see the map, also it will be much clearer. So the infighting is very intensive, and here we see the 3 axes of advancing today towards Hammam al-Alil and towards another town called Ashura, more north, which is a dense populated area, but we're still very far from the town of Mosul that we can see here on the map. And there's another, today the front that was opened, it was from Bashika through Bartella, which is around 20 kilometers away from Mosul. Infighting is around Bartella now, not in the town. They're not far from the town. And the northern front, which was opened also today from towards the town of Batnai, and Tel Kif is a stronghold also where the Islamic State is present. And we see that the Peshmerga and the Iraqi forces are trying at least to destroy the first defenses, the first line of defenses and the second line of defenses of the jihadis. And from the jihadi side, they are putting up the fight. They sent more than between 20 and 25 kamikaze attacks since yesterday. Here we see the jihadis in the town of Mosul at the night of the first attack. So they deployed into the town to show that they hold the town. Of course, they are masked, and they are masked for a very particular reason, because that we know that a kind of rebellion was tried to be incited by the coalition forces and by the Iraqi forces. There had been more than 15 executions of people in Mosul. Today, 2 Peshmerga, Kurdish Peshmerga that were caught by the jihadis were executed, and their bodies were put under a bridge. So the fighting is very intensive, but up to this point, we are still far from the town of Mosul, and we are still witnessing warfare in small villages and in open spaces, which has nothing to do with fighting in urban regions. And if we can maybe look at the map one more time, we see that the western side of the town of Mosul is kept open. We're gonna see it. The western side is kept open for a very simple reason that we see here, that all this region till Tal Afar and till Sinjar, where the Islamic State conducted attacks yesterday, is still held by the jihadis. And we know that in military warfare, when an attacking force is trying to encircle a town, whatever the town is, they always leave a way out in order for the people defending the town, in order to shorten the period of fighting. But as the American president said it yesterday, and as all military experts are saying, the fighting can be long, and still we are very far from urban fighting that we can witness in Mosul, as we witnessed in Fallujah, for example, in Ramadi, in Beiji, in Tikrit, remembering that all those towns were completely destroyed, and the population is today living in camps.
Wassim, today the French President François Hollande, speaking in a conference about the future of Mosul, said that Islamic State leaders are already fleeing the town. What have you heard about that?
I didn't hear anything from this sort, but maybe the French president is maybe informed from his sources. But what we should know is we are in wartime, and in wartime there's what we call psychological operations, which means trying to demise the enemy by hitting his morale. So by saying that the leaders are freeing the town, maybe the soldiers will flee, and maybe the population will rise against the jihadis. So this kind of information is to be taken very carefully. It might be true, but it might be not true too. We heard the same thing before the Iraqi forces took Fallujah, Ramadi. We always hear the same thing. And one more thing that we should point out, that the local leaders in the town of Mosul and in the province of Nainawa are mostly Iraqis from the city and from the same province. So like 10 out of 15 most prominent leaders in the town of Mosul and in the region of Nainawa are from this region. So we can imagine that they will put up the fight, even though that they might maybe try to exfiltrate their families. But I guess that it is too soon to say that they're abandoning the town, because up to this point, there is no real military pressure on the town itself in order for them to push them in order to leave the town and trying to flee the town.
All right, Wasim Nasr, thank you so much for that.
First look at the driver facing charges after a deadly crash in Phoenix. This is 26-year-old Randall Nelson, charged with negligent homicide and aggravated assault. Police say they are investigating whether he was drunk when he slammed into another car. It happened at 28th Drive in Cactus early this morning. The crash pushing the victim's car into a truck that was sitting at the intersection. 2 women were in that car. 1 was killed at the scene. The other is in the hospital with life-threatening injuries tonight. The driver of the truck